It's so nice to greet you and to have you here with us. I am very pleased to welcome you on behalf of Centro Eleia. This year Congress, thank you. Our Congress topic is trauma, social, family, subjective. And we have been studying your contributions and your scientific work, which devotes sharply to trauma.
Yeah.
I'm going to read your curriculum. Let me introduce you to the audience. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to read it in Spanish. Is it okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. Bueno,
I'll learn a little Spanish.
Oh, great. Great. Nuestro invitado de hoy, muy especial, el doctor Howard Levine. Él es miembro de la Sociedad Freudiana Contemporánea y del Instituto Psicoanalítico de Nueva Inglaterra del Este, PINE. Fue miembro del Consejo de Administración de la IPA, la Asociación Psicoanalítica Internacional, y es parte del Consejo Editorial del International Journal of Psychoanalysis, y también de la revista Psychoanalytic Inquiry. El doctor Levine atiende pacientes de manera particular en el área de Brookline, Massachusetts, Boston. Ha escrito varios artículos, capítulos de libros y reseñas sobre el proceso y la técnica psicoanalítica, el tratamiento de trastornos de la personalidad primitivos y las consecuencias y el tratamiento sobre pacientes que presentan traumas tempranos y abuso sexual infantil. Es editor en Routledge de la serie Beyond Studies Book Series. También es autor del libro Affect, Representation and Language, Between the Silence and the Cry. Este es un libro que está próximamente por publicarse en Routledge. Ha trabajado en varias coediciones, entre ellas está una coedición junto con Lawrence Brown, Growth and Turbulence in the Container Contained, un trabajo junto con Dominique Scarfone de coedición on Represented States and the Construction of Meaning, junto con Gail Reed, Responses to Freud's Screen Memories Paper, también junto con Giuseppe Civitarese, el libro The Wilfred Bion Tradition, publicado por Carnac, junto con David Power, Engaging Primitive Anxieties and the Emerging Self, publicado también por Carnac, y Representation and the Work of the Negative, André Green Revisited, publicado por Carnac. So, Dr. Levine, let's start this conversation. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Elena.
On your works, you sustain that trauma is highly subjective, that experiences which may be traumatic for someone may not be as intolerable for others.
Yes.
And you say that that events and consequences that we call trauma are as varied as ages, at developmental stages, and as mental capacities for those who are affected.
Yes.
Can you tell us about this interesting idea?
Sure. Let me start by giving you a simple metaphor. The problem with the word trauma is that it's used to refer to an external event, the consequences of that external event, the immediate consequences, and the long-range consequences of that external event. So immediately, the same word is being used to refer to three different aspects of the phenomena. In a paper that is coming out in the International Journal. I use the following example. If there's a huge rock slide into a lake in the mountains, and it produces disturbances and waves and ripples and so on, and then those disturbances and waves and ripples have long-term ecological consequences for the plants and animals that live around the lake. The rock falling into the water, the immediate disturbance, and the long-term consequences are all referred to as traumatic. But they're different parts of an ongoing process. So there's that immediate confusion in the use of the word. In psychoanalysis, um, there's often a confusion between the external event, the developmental level of the mind, and the level of the mind of the individual and its capacity to handle the external event, and the internal events that get stirred up. And all of this is mixed up in the term trauma. When you're an infant and you're a young child and you're growing, if you lose your mother at the age of 6 months of life, or 18 months of life, or 25 months of life, or 5 years of 5 years of age, or 12 years of age, or 15 years of age, the traumatic impact of the loss of the mother is taking place in relation to a developing child's mind at different levels of the capacity to deal with that trauma. And all of this has to be part of the difference that it makes. It's not the same to lose one's mother at 18 months as it is to lose one's mother at 18 years, because the loss takes place for an individual with a different capacity to internally manage the consequences of that. And in addition, when we're talking about trauma psychologically, psychoanalytically, there's one more level and factor that comes into it. It's what happens internally or externally. It's what the capacity is of the individual to whom it happens to detoxify, metabolize, and adapt to and deal with the events. And the third factor is what does the rest of the family and community surround do to respond to the trauma? So that in a sense, when a bad thing happens that might, although not necessarily, be labeled traumatic, you can't know whether it's going to get that label or not until you see what the future is that happens. I'll give you a very concrete example. A number of years ago, there was a cooperative relationship between the city of Boston, where I live, and the city of Haifa in Israel. And because there was a connection between the two social service and mental health associations in each city, I wound up going to Haifa for a couple of months to consult with and work with the psychologists and social service groups in Haifa. And in fact, I traded houses with the head of social service from Haifa. He came to work in Boston for 2 months. I came to work in Haifa. He lived in my house. I lived in his house. I had done some work early in my career with survivors of the Holocaust who had migrated to Boston after the Second War, and children and grandchildren of survivors who in the Boston area. And there was a group of psychologists and social workers and therapists who were doing similar work in Israel. But immediately I recognized that there was a greater capacity for resilience in the Israeli group because the whole culture was organized around support for Holocaust survivors and their children and grandchildren. I mean, that was a country that was essentially founded on the basis of people being immigrants from the Second World War and survivors of the Holocaust, and that they had cultural and social institutions and attitudes and publicity and so on that that were all aimed at supporting these people recovering from that particular kind of bad situation. And so it ameliorated and curtailed some of the traumatic impact because it was available to them in a way that things like that were not available in the United States. Other things were available. But so, you know, you can't know whether an event is going to be called traumatic or how traumatic or in what ways it's going to be traumatic until you factor in what's the level of autonomous capacity the individual has to deal with the noxious stimulus, how noxious is the stimulus, what's the developmental level of the individual to which it occurs, and what's the response of the community and the family, the social surround in attempting to try to heal it. So all of that goes into whether or not we call something traumatic.
You say that it is not possible to speak of trauma categorically, that it is a concept which cannot be generalized.
Well, you can make certain generalizations, but you can't know a priori that X is going to be traumatic for somebody. All you know is that it's a bad thing when X happens. And what's the difference between a bad thing and trauma? Well, that you have to look at to what extent does the event that happens, and the event can be something external or something internal. In other words, one's relationship to one's drives is potentially inherently traumatic if the drives aren't handled by one's psyche in a good enough way. So you can't know. So that what the key question is, to what extent does the event, whether its origin is external or internal, disturb the psychic regulatory processes and developmental capacities and needs of the psyche of a given individual?
In your work, you start talking about Freud. You mention Freud in your work, and this has to deal with what you're saying now. And you say that is precisely the concept of trauma, understood as Freud explains it in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. That concept, trauma, is one of the roles in which he enters to a different scene or region, which is the non-neurotic. Even though Freud offers us a consistent theory of neurosis, this is the point in which he opens for a different way of thinking and understanding the mind. And well, you explained that the term of trauma.
Let me explain that. The first coherent great development in Freud's theory had to do with neurosis. Certain thoughts, certain wishes, certain fantasies, certain memories had to be made unconscious because they were unacceptable. They were unacceptable to one's sense of values, to the superego, and to what Freud called the dominant mass of ideas. This is not who I am as a person, so I can't stand to know it about myself. This is not who I want to be as a person, so I can't stand to know it about myself. Or it makes me anxious to think, if I were to think that and to know that I was this kind of person, so I can't stand to think it about myself. And I take these ideas and I make myself unaware of them. They become unconscious, but they remain intact as ideas. Okay, this is the story of neurosis. And all that Freud wrote about dreams, about jokes, about slips of the tongue, about symbols, about chains of association, about listening to the free associations and seeing what they continually point to that's not manifestly visible. All of this has to do with this repressed stuff that's unacceptable or anxiety producing or violates the way the ego ideal wants to see yourself, or the way the superego says you should behave ethically, and so has to be hidden, but it remains intact even though it's unconscious. But what Freud's discovery was in the second half of well, he sort of intimated it because it's there from the very beginning. But what he develops later on begins to develop in the second half of our life, and what he left it to us to develop further is that there's a vast area of the unconscious which consists of forces and turbulences and emotions and sensorial disturbances, as Bion would call it, that is not yet formulated sufficiently and developed sufficiently to have adequate meaning, to be called ideas, wishes, fantasies. All it is embroiling chaos, enigmatic, ineffable storms of something that, if it can be tamed, can be transformed and directed into specific wishes, needs, desires, etc., and so contained and metabolized and controlled in that way.
You say are represented, unbound force, something that overwhelmed and disorganized the psychic functioning.
Yes, well, this unrepresented part of the mind, which Freud eventually called the id, because most of the id and most of the unconscious, except for the thin layer of the repressed unconscious in neurosis that I described before, is force without meaning. And it's got basically two different potentials to it. One potential is that it's a growth plate for continual psychic development. So that which is unrepresented, which is always present, which comes from our being in the world, and it comes from our being organic entities with bodies that, we give us drives and feelings. If this can be transformed, contained, metabolized in beyond sense, it can be the stuff out of which our creativity and our capacities continue to grow and evolve. But if it overwhelms the containing, metabolizing, transforming capacities of the mind, if it is the unrepresented caused by disruptions in the continuity in going on being in Winnicott's sense, then it becomes a source of distress and a burden, because it's what's been described as black holes or voids in the mind, a hole in the fabric of the mind, was a term that Andre Green used.
Mhm.
It's the stuff of turbulence that tends to disrupt psychological functioning, psychological regulation, and psychological development. And so what in 1920, Freud had gone through the First War. He had gone through the First War, and he was going through the terrible Spanish flu epidemic as well. He was also realizing that his initial theories about neurosis did not apply to everybody and did not apply sufficiently to everybody. Negative therapeutic reactions, unconscious guilt, impulsive behaviors, things like perversions, addictions, psychosomatic reactions, and so on. These were all somehow beyond neurosis. And Freud's original theory was that we operate according to the pleasure principle as modified into the reality principle. And then he found that, particularly in negative therapeutic reactions and unconscious guilt, that people were not operating according to the pleasure principle. They were somehow operating according to some other mechanism that was beyond the pleasure principle. That's why he named it what he did. And in that paper, he talked about trauma. And he came back to a definition of trauma that he had started to evolve in his earlier work. And you can see bits and pieces of it if you look back from 1920 when he did Beyond the Pleasure Principle. He defined trauma as a breach in the ego's capacity to provide a barrier, to provide containment and regulation. Things in the ego got out of control because of some overwhelming impact of something, external, internal. It was too much. Or in the case of a developing infant who needs a continual sort of input and stimulus from maternal object, paternal objects, and so on, it wasn't enough. The environmental provision, in Winnicott's terms, was not attuned to what it needed to be. It was either too much or too little. And then once the disruption occurs, the surround did not come in and provide the necessary containment and ancillary support to keep it from getting out of hand. So that defines trauma, the too muchness or too littleness of it. And this is a fundamental view in Freud. At the end of Freud's life, he revised his instinct theory. His final instinct theory shows two basic instincts: the life forces and the death forces, eros and thanatos, eros and the death instinct. And what does Freud say? He says they have to be fused together and work cooperatively, otherwise there are problems. And what does he say? He says in the most general, non-specific way. He says eros binds and the death instinct breaks apart. And if you want to think about that in modern systems theory, a living organism synthesizes and metabolizes. And it has to do each within certain limits, within optimal limits. And if it can, it will grow and thrive until it reaches the limits of its capacities, and then it begins to decline. But in order to grow and thrive, to metabolize and synthesize, to bind and unbind, within those limits, you have to have an intact organism internally and a good enough surround externally. And that's sort of a basic biological statement that Freud made and applied to the functioning of the mind. I mean, it was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. And it came out of his clinical experience. It came out of his clinical experience with veterans of the war who had war neuroses. They didn't use the term PTSD in those days. They said they had war neuroses. And he found that in the dreams of veterans who had been traumatized, and traumatized in the sense of they had broken down in their life, they dreamt about their adverse war experiences repeatedly over and over and over again, seemingly without any change. So it wasn't as if they were working something through in the dreams. They seemed fixated and stuck over and over again. Just parenthetically, when I was a very little boy, so I was born during the Second War. When I was a very little boy, at the age of 4, I lived in an apartment building. My downstairs neighbor had a brother who was suffering from post-traumatic stress, from a war neurosis. I don't know what the details of the story was. I never learned it. But here was this young guy who was sort of like an automaton, a zombie. I would play in the backyard we had a little backyard. I would play in the little backyard, and he would sit on the bench, and he was working out chess moves on a chessboard by himself. There was like a cone of silence around this man. You know, a little kid, you'd go past somebody, someone would say, "Hi, Howard." You know, this guy, nothing.
Not reaction.
No reaction. And it was like he was, he was terribly, terribly withdrawn. I approached him and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said to me, "I'm playing chess." And I said, "Will you teach me?" And he looked at me and he said, "Yes." And he started to teach me the chess moves. And, I was a very little boy. I wasn't Bobby Fischer or somebody like this who was going to be a chess genius. But I kept him company sometimes. And we would play chess together, or I would watch him work out moves, and he would sometimes say something to me. This was a guy who was suffering from a traumatic war neurosis. For whatever reasons, his experience was too much. And I don't know what access to help or treatment he had or whatever back then. But this is the kind of stuff that Freud was talking about. And these people are haunted by their experiences, by the repetition over and over and over again in their dreams, in their thoughts, and so on. And we know so much more about that now in terms of PTSD.
You have also said on your thoughts about Freud that it remains an open question as whether or to what extent trauma of some kind lies, you say, at the heart of every process that is viewed as pathogenic. And you also quote Freud. I want to quote you quoting Freud on war neurosis, on psychoanalysis of war neurosis. Freud says, and you quoted, "We have a perfect right to describe repression, which lies at the basis of every neurosis, as a reaction to trauma, as an elementary traumatic neurosis." Could you expand on this idea?
Well, I think what Freud was getting at was that the need to repress something, instead of being able to keep it in mind, to repress something after it had already been formed into a thought, is evidence of the mind's having to resort to an extreme circumstance in order to protect itself from something. And in a way, he was saying that extreme circumstance, the anxiety produced by knowing that this is what I want, this is what I feel, this is what I wish for, this is what I remember, this is what I fantasy, that this in itself is, in a micro sense, a warning of something traumatic or about to become traumatic. And so getting rid of it from consciousness is an indication that too much is already looming on the horizon and something radical has to be done about it. And in the first half of his of his life, he talked about Freud talked about repression as the archetype defense. Repression is the archetypal defense of neurosis. Towards the end of his life, he started to use a spectrum of other terms. They've been translated into English. I can't, my German is not good enough to give you. They have been translated into English as denial, disavowal. Lacan used the term that's been translated as foreclosure. Green used the term effacement. Joyce McDougall used the term ejection from the psyche. And the difference between the two is this. For this, I need my magic pen. When you repress something because it's unacceptable, you get rid of it out of consciousness, but you don't break it apart. It's a pen, whether I can pay attention to it or whether I hide it. So poor Oedipus, he wanted, let's say the Oedipus complex of a little boy, and let's say Freud's assumption that a little boy at some point wants to get rid of his father. He wants to get rid of his father and have his mother to himself. Oh, this is unacceptable. I'm going to be punished if I feel this way. I can't let myself know I have these thoughts. I have to hide them. But those thoughts remain intact as thoughts, even though they're unconscious. So as a friend of mine once said, when you repress something, you always have to remember what it is you're supposed to forget. That's repression. This other spectrum, denial, disavowal, foreclosure, ejection from the psyche, effacement, when you get rid of the pen, you break it up into its fragments. It's no longer a pen hidden behind my back. You can't just pull it out and recover it from repression. It doesn't exist anymore. It's been fragmented. It's been destroyed. It's been broken into bits. Something's done to it. When during World War II, when the Germans invaded France, in certain towns, the French took down the names of the streets so that they would slow down and confuse the invading army. They took all the street signs down, but the streets were left intact. Sometimes, if there was a bridge over a river, they blew the bridge up. That's different. Taking down the names of the street signs is repression. Blowing up the bridge is effacement, foreclosure, etc. There's no pen behind my back because I blew it up. It's different. That essentially means that there are two levels of unconscious. There's a represented unconscious that Freud talked about due to repression, and there's everything else. The everything else is due to perception, it's due to the drives, it's due to having a body, and it's due to traumatic disturbances in the past. That's the unrepresented unconscious, the unstructured unconscious. And that difference, appreciating that difference, is there implicitly in earlier writings in Freud, but in 1920, in retrospect, it begins to become very clear. And then it's what Freud looks at in the rest of his life when he looks at psychosis as the model of the mind, instead of perversion as the model of the mind, neurosis as the model of the mind.
In terms of Bion, and we are speaking, of course, about Bion all the time in this in this conversation and these ideas, you would say that the mind has a challenge to construct meaning, to represent, to create dreams and memories for every raw experience, for every raw emotional experience.
To create meaning.
To create meaning, to create meaning.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter if the raw experience comes from the inside or for example, as in puberty, you say when sexuality strikes a child, all the drives, and it doesn't matter. You say if it comes from the inside or from the outside, as an earthquake or a pandemic in which the outside becomes a threat. So this dichotomy you were saying before between trauma coming from the outside or coming from the inside, it doesn't stand anymore. It's the theory of thinking, Bion's theory of thinkings, which matter. The mind in this challenge to construct meaning.
Yes. And by thinking, you have to remember it's not just about thoughts, but it's about emotionally contained, connected thoughts. It's about psychic regulation and homeostasis of the turbulence and excitation that comes inherently from being alive in the world. That's what quote unquote Bion's thinking is. I mean, it's not just about thoughts and words. You had the inside, the outside. When I was younger, there was a debate. There was a debate between non-psychoanalytic psychiatrists and psychologists and psychoanalysts about trauma. There began to be developed outside of psychoanalysis an idea, which I think is incorrect, that psychoanalysis only had to do with wishes and fears that came out of one's fantasy and was applicable to that. And when bad things happened in real life, that was trauma, and that required a different kind of theory and a different kind of treatment and so on. And so at a certain point, when in the 70s and the 80s in the United States, when feminism was becoming very active, there was a notion that children who had experienced incest and who were sexually abused should not be treated by psychoanalysis because they suffered from quote unquote external trauma. And at that time, I was a young analyst, and I had in analysis a couple of patients who had been sexually abused as children. And I felt that psychoanalysis was a very powerful tool in dealing with the sequelae and helping these patients. And I began to ask my friends and colleagues and my teachers locally and nationally, have you ever analyzed anybody who was sexually abused? Have you ever analyzed anybody who had been a victim of incest as a child? And people would say, yeah, I've seen 2 or 3 cases, but I don't have not enough to have generalize conclusions about it, or, yeah, I've got one case now, or, nobody could say anything definitively. So I said, look, everybody has a few cases. Let's get together. I set up and participated in at least 3 different groups, locally, nationally, internationally. And we studied over the course of, I don't know, 3 years or so, maybe 18 cases, 20 cases. And out of that work came one of the early books that I did called Adult Analysis in Childhood Sexual Abuse, book that I edited and wrote a couple of chapters for, which said a couple of things. One is that it said that it tried to demonstrate that psychoanalysis not only could be helpful to these patients, but was one of the treatments of choice, because it could make very powerful remedial therapeutic impacts on their lives. Number 2, it implied that psychoanalysis was effective in situations that had produced trauma. In this case, sexual trauma of this kind in childhood. And the third thing that it taught me was that what I thought my teachers had taught me about psychoanalysis didn't always apply. This may not be the fault of my teachers. I may have been a bad student about this. But the assumption was that if you listen to the patient's associations and you analyze the defenses that you found, that sooner or later the relevant material would appear in the manifest content of the patient's discourse. In other words, there was always something repressed that if you could deal with the anxiety and relieve it so that it wasn't as threatening to know it, then it would come into consciousness. It would be a pen that returned. Okay? With these patients and with other patients, I treated a few bulimic patients and anorexic patients who would never talk about their eating. And psychosomatic patients in general, they would you could I'd still be sitting there waiting for them and sitting there analyzing defenses, and they still wouldn't talk about it 40 years later. Something different had to be done. And at that point, I began to think about and develop some ideas about the need for the analyst's participation. And I later found out that Bion talked about this in great detail as intuition, and how the elements and facts of that the psychoanalyst is concerned with are not those of sensuous reality, sight, touch, smell, sound, etc., but they're psychic qualities that have to be intuited, that produce sensuous phenomena as a result, so that you can infer them back from the sensuous. So it wasn't only about empirical observation. It was about some kind of intuitive capacity to be in contact with the patient and what's going on inside. So in that book, and in an issue of Psychoanalytic Inquiry that I edited subsequently, I talked about the way the incest or the childhood trauma could be inferred as repeating, but in a different register, in a different set of ways. And that I'll give you an example. I was working on that book. I had a patient in analysis, And ordinarily, when I write, and I've done a lot of writing, I don't ask for permission from the patient to write. I disguise the material so that anybody reading it would not be able to recognize and identify that patient. So one of the accepted ways of maintaining confidentiality in the psychoanalytic literature is that it's disguised so that it's safe from third-party recognition of who the patient is. The patient herself may be able to recognize it because they know that they were in analysis with me, and they may recognize something that they said or I said, but someone else wouldn't say, "Oh, this is Mary Smith," or Jane Doe. But because this was a patient who had been who had been sexually overstimulated by her father, and so misused for his purposes in that way, and because she was in the field and might read something that I wrote or edited herself, I thought that it really required her conscious consent if I was going to use any material. So I told her that I was working on a chapter for a book, that my experiences with her I thought were important and relevant. I wanted to use them to teach other people something about how to deal with similar situations, but I did not want to use them unless she gave me consent. And so what I said was, if you will agree, I will show you what I have written that relates to you and our work together. I'd like you to read it. Feel free to make comments to make sure that you agree and that I've gotten it right. And if you're comfortable, I'll use it in the book. And what I'm trying to illustrate is this. If I would have taken something from her for my needs and purposes without her consent, that would have been a transference repetition of a microtraumatic aspect, potentially microtraumatic aspect of a father who uses a child for his own sexual stimulation. It's not the same thing. I mean, I may get excited about what I write, so there's a little bit of frisson, but it's not sexual in the usual way. But that's the kind of thing that I discovered, that the patient would never identify that as anything in relation, initially, as anything in relation to the sexual abuse situation. The analyst would. And instead of following and following and following, I learned that you can use that to move things along by being the one to introduce that, in its funny way, this is kind of similar to what happened because blah 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 blah. That was a discovery of my representing something that was in the turbulence of the situation, and perhaps even driving me unconsciously to be the predator by picking this patient and this episode to use as material for the book. It's a kind of civilized version of a narcissistic appropriation, which is what a sexual abuse of a child is.
Speaking of technique, I remember
appropriation.
The narcissistic. I remember that you stresses that this quote of Freud, that enemies could not be slain in absentia.
That's
you
right.
emphasize the use.
That's right.
Of transference. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. You have to. in some potentially micro traumatic way, not it's terrible if it becomes the sexual abuse of a patient, if you wind up sleeping with your patient. I mean, that's not a micro trauma, that's a major problem. But in some micro traumatic way, we have to occupy the position of the or a position analogous to the traumatizing object, to the so you have to allow yourself to find yourself willy-nilly embodying the negative transference. Because as Freud said in Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, which is 1914, which is the period of his great conclusions about the treatment of neurosis, it has to appear in the transference. You can't slay the enemy in absentia or by effigy.
Presence is required. The presence is required.
You have to actualize that in the transference. You can't do it intentionally. You have to allow yourself to find yourself doing something that comes close enough to indicating that role and that situation and that scene. You have to recognize it and then interpret it. In the case of it's very interesting. In the case of my patient with the sexual abuse, she read the material. She came back. She said, "I think you've accurately described it." I said, "Thank you." She said, "But I don't want you to use it." And we talked about it. I didn't try to convince her. I said, "Okay, I won't use it, but let's talk about, tell me why. I want to try to understand more of your thinking and feeling about it." What she was doing was saying no to her abuser, which she couldn't do as a child. And I thought, she's rewriting the play. she's rewriting the play and protecting herself. And if she could have done that, it's sad, because if she could have done that as a child, it would have spared her a great deal of difficulty in life. But she couldn't, because she was a youngster, a young kid, and this was her father. So you can see that the repetition continues to come into the transference in different ways. And if you weren't there and you didn't have this way of thinking, psychoanalytic way of trying to understand and think about things, you might not see it, you might not recognize it, but it's there. And every no is important in that treatment. So when she would fuss about this or rebel against that, there's also a life-affirming process in that. I can say no. I can be in charge of myself. This is the no I couldn't, this is, and all of this is unconscious, of course, and inferred and intuited by the analyst. But this is the no I couldn't say when I wished I was able to say it when I was a child, when X and Y happened.
It also reminds me that you spoke in your work about the Bion's concept of suffer.
Yes.
That Bion says that the pain cannot be absent from the personality, and
right.
But is very different for him. He distinguished the pain that can be suffered from just the feeling the pain.
Right.
Your patient goes through a suffering. In this sense, in Bion's senses, go to a suffering process. It's like for the first time she's able to tolerate and to understand at some point, not in a masochistic way, of course, not a suffering in a masochistic way, but it seems to be referring to raw emotional experience, which is transformed into meaningful experience, even if it hurts.
Yeah.
And your patient seems to be acquiring this new position.
Yeah. I don't know if the language is the same in Spanish as it is in English. In the St. James Bible, there's the expression about Jesus, suffer the little children to come unto him. And that sense of the word suffer doesn't mean to have pain. It means to experience, to present yourself, to pay attention, or something like that. And Bion plays on that word suffering. And he's quoting somebody. Maybe it'll come to me later. But Bion says, there are patients who feel pain, that is, they hurt, they have sensation, but they can't suffer pain. And what that means is, what he really means is, they can't make sense of that pain that they feel and make it coherent in terms of their life experience and the idiom of their life trajectory. So that, and he goes on to say, they can't suffer, they feel pain, but they can't suffer pain. And as a result, when they can't make use of, they can't suffer good feeling. And again, not in the hurtful sense, but in the sense of being able to experience and make sense of good feeling, so that they can't balance it out. So you get a typical borderline patient who, I mean, no patient is typical, but I'm thinking of one guy I'm seeing now. You get a typical borderline patient who's had a lot of bad experiences in life with disappointing parents and overstimulating parents and emotionally inaccessible parents, and so on. You get, this person feels hopeless. They expect bad things. They can't give up control. They can't let themselves depend because they've been hurt too much and too often. They tear into themselves because I'm a lousy parent, I'm not earning enough money, I'm a lousy husband, I've done this wrong, I've done that wrong, no matter what you've said to me or what we've talked about, I keep making the same kinds of errors and mistakes in life, blah, blah, blah. This is in the face of having small changes, not overwhelming, not the war's not over, it's still a battle. Small changes, small successes, small moments of good contact with his wife, with his kids, in his work, winning a prize as being a teacher, having recognition in his field. He's not able to suffer the good things to balance out the pain of his tearing into himself for having failed at being this and not being good enough at being that in any given moment, which is real. You know, he lost his temper once again at his kids, and he felt like throwing them out of the house, and he felt like this and he felt like that, and now he's lacerating himself for it. But he can't suffer the good to modulate these kinds of storms of self-hatred. That's what Bion's talking about.
That's why Bion says the analysis good analysis must help the patient to suffer in this way, to experience.
Yes, to have more contact with the reality of himself. And in Freud's terms, we would say that a good analysis helps someone to maintain the cathexes that allow for representations of reality. Don't turn away from reality even when it's painful, unacceptable, unwanted. Don't destroy your capacity to know, because knowing is painful. And what did Freud say? Freud said, in analysis can sometimes clear up neurotic unhappiness, but it can't do anything about ordinary human misery. You know, the idea that analysis is going to make everything perfect. No, you know, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann's comment to her patient that was became the title of the book. I never promised you a rose garden.
A rose garden.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This same patient, another patient complained to me, you analysts, you promise that everything is going to be fine and it's not. And I said, whoa, I said, you know, if I did, that's my error, because I would say that rather than promise that everything's going to be fine, if analysis works, you're going to be in better contact with yourself, and you're going to know more and feel more and have the capacity to tolerate more the feeling and knowing yourself. Now, some of that's going to be good, I hope, and some of it's not, because that's what life is. So the idea that it's all going to be roses, if I ever promised you that or implied that, I apologize, because that's not what it is.
Mm-hmm. I never promised you a rose garden.
Yeah, I never promised you a rose garden.
A rose garden. Dr. Levine, it has been such an enriching conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Our time is unfortunately up, and we really appreciate so much your participation in this Congress.
Thank you for inviting me, and I think the interview has been at a really important and high level, and so
Thank you.
I'm sure that
Thank you so much.
we'll be up for that as well, and so it's going to be a great success.
Thank you so much, Dr. Levine.
Okay, take care now.